We were looking before we started recording. David, it has been almost a year since you and I did an episode together. And then Andras, it has been 7 months. I think it was like last year at some point. It's been, I think since the last time we recorded, I met you in person. I think that has happened. In Los Angeles, that was 3 months ago.
LA Confidential.
Yeah, having some lunch at a diner, and we sat there for like 4 hours. I think we were there a while. On this episode of the Culture Cast, we are kicking off Epic Month with a look at a film that these two gentlemen who are joining me both have a lot to say about. First, joining me all the way from the University of Texas Tech, or I guess Texas Tech University, probably the better way of putting it. He is the professor of media and communications over there. We have done a couple episodes before. Dr. David Perlmutter.
Hello, thank you.
And kind of like I've already alluded to, he has an album out right now. He has his own podcast. That album is called Recognize, De-Escalate, and Decode. You can find it streaming most places and physical copies in a lot of record stores. He hosts his own podcast, The World Is Wrong, which is an interesting podcast that I think everybody should be listening to because it's very different from what you would be expecting. Your friend and mine, Andras Jones.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to talk about Reds.
Yeah, so like Andras just mentioned, we are going to be kicking off Epic Month with a look at 1981's Warren Beatty co-written, produced, and directed and acted Reds.
You want to have freedom, you got to go where the freedom is, don't you? You're going to go to waste in Portland. Come to New York.
What as?
Huh?
What as?
What do you mean, what as?
What as? Your girlfriend?
Just tell me what as.
It's nearly Thanksgiving. Why don't you come as a turkey?
I don't want to play in your yard. I don't like you anymore.
What would you think if I asked you to do something that might seem a little selfish?
Well, I think you should.
Good, because I'd like you to take a look at my work and tell me what you think.
You'll be sorry when you see me sliding down our cellar door.
I'd say you tell Mr. Morgan and Mr. DuPont and Mr. Rockefeller to get over there and do some of the fighting.
You can holler down our rain barrel. You can climb our apple tree. I can't work around you.
You tell me why you're doing this.
I'm not taken seriously when you're around.
When I'm around, you're not taken seriously.
Oh, God, this is not good. I don't want to play in your yard if you won't be good to me.
If you were mine, I wouldn't share you with anybody or anything.
There's something that I have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me anything.
No?
No. You want to get married? Does this mean that we have to cheat, or is this free and independent marriage? You're a lying Irish whore from Portland, and you use me to get Jack Reed to marry you.
Who?
What do you mean, who?
Who was it?
Who was what? Jack dreams that he can hustle the American working man, whose one dream is to be rich enough not to have to work, into a revolution led by his party. Is the Socialist Party prepared to take a position on the draft or not?
My body!
The officer, these men have the legal right to assemble. What the hell are you doing? Me? I write.
You right?
Huh?
You wrong.
I'd rather be with a fighter who wants to change the world than a critic who wants to mourn it.
Well, the place to be now is Russia.
You don't have to tell me what's happening in Russia. I read the papers.
Well, come with me. Support you and we'll join you in revolution. Revolution is dissent. Always. You don't rewrite what I write. That's when you
So, like I mentioned, directed by, co-written by, produced by, and starring Warren Beatty. It is based on the life and times of John Reed, the journalist and writer who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, which is about the October Revolution. Yes, the movie is about communism and Russia and the Russian Revolution, so the title kind of gives it away. Film stars a whole bunch of other people, including Diane Keaton.
No spoilers, Chris, about the Russian Revolution. It hasn't played out yet, so I don't think you should give it away.
The ending of this movie is not known yet. But yeah, as we've kind of alluded to, it is about the life and times of John Reed. So it's a 3-hour movie. It's obviously it's an epic. So most of the movies this month are going to be rather long and very, broad in scope, at least this movie. But it covers a lot of ground. There's a whole lot of people in the movie. So I'm going to kick it to you first, Dr. Perlmutter. When did you see it first? What did you think then? And what did you think rewatching it for this episode?
I was a first-year student in college, and I was really interested in film, and I watched everything that came out. And so Warren Beatty, of course, was extremely famous as everything, film director, writer, star, and he came out with what was presented as an attempt by him to make an epic movie in the style and of previous ones like David Lean, Dr. Zhivago, and Lawrence of Arabia. And I couldn't wait to go see it in the theater. So I saw it in the theater. I saw it in the big screen. And then I think I saw it again with somebody who wanted to go see it. So I saw it like a week later. And then it was a couple of years into the world of something called VHS tape that I saw it again. But I have not seen it in probably 20 years since then.
So what did you think rewatching it for this episode?
I decided not to, just as an experiment. I wanted to just talk about my impressions and then my memories of this, which are very odd in particular, I think, or its place within my cultural memory. And I have brought up particular scenes of this movie in class. I've had assignments where I had them watch a particular moment or two in this movie as part of a discussion of tropes or genre moments. So I've gone back to it, but I didn't want to do a full, I've watched it 34 times now and I can see something I didn't see at first. I wanted just what I saw at first and what I remembered.
So, Andras, I'll kick it to you then before we kind of open the conversation up. Same question. First time you saw it, thoughts then? Rewatching it now, thoughts now?
I think the first time I saw it was on videotape, although I have very strong memories of those Oscars. So I feel like so the first time I was exposed to it was in the clips that they played at the Academy Awards that year. But then I saw it when I saw it on VHS, probably towards the end of my high school years, probably like 84, 85, 86, around that time. It just blew me away. I didn't know, I should say, we'll get into it, but Warren Beatty is one of my favorite filmmakers of all time. I have a real strong affinity for him as a filmmaker. And I didn't know that when I saw it, but this was one of those films that really drew me to him as a filmmaker. And in part, it is because of the great performances that he gets out of these amazing actors, particularly for me at the time, Nicholson's performance and Hackman's, as well as Beatty's and Maureen Stapleton's, and everyone's fantastic. But I feel like particularly Jack Nicholson in this, he just really in a few scenes just blew me away with his performance. And then really, this is one of those films that I probably go back to once every decade since. I don't want to say it's almost a comfort movie, I guess, weirdly. And I take great pleasure in it. And I intended to watch it for this, but I'm in the middle of a move, so time got ahead of me. So what I ended up doing was just kind of basically watching a 3-hour movie in an hour and a half, going through and remembering, okay, this is what happens in this scene, and this is what happened in this scene. The one thing I missed out on doing that was really getting into tracking the way the film deals with the history and the politics of the time in a way that I would have liked to. But I think I have I got myself back up to speed on the general beats in this film, and I'm ready to talk about it.
And unlike either of y'all, I had not ever seen this film. I am actually, again, nothing against Warren Beatty. I haven't seen most of his works. I have not seen Bonnie and Clyde. That is something that's, again, on a long list of things to check out eventually. One of the episodes I've done for the Projection Booth, we talked about The Parallax View, which I did enjoy, which was very different from this, obviously, but kind of still in the same vein of, a character kind of being at odds with the system. So I went into this only knowing as much as it is an epic film. Warren Beatty is playing a real person, and it is about a specific time and specific place. And it's, again, directed and written by, and so all the kind of qualifiers of this being a Warren Beatty thing just out in front. That's all I'd known about it. So sitting down to watch it, I enjoyed it a fair amount. I think what's interesting are the things about it that feel contemporary that at the time would have been like, wow, what a novel concept. But there are some things in this movie that are really well done that I feel like are ahead of their time in terms of the way the movie's presented. There are some moments in the movie that do kind of, and I can see where you're kind of getting at, Dr. Perlmutter, with the tropiness of it. There is some tropiness to this movie. Obviously, this is a historical film, but it's also a biopic in a way of a specific time and a specific place. So it does kind of traffic in a little bit of that. I think, though, overall, I enjoyed the movie, and I think that the movie's message in this day and age, I think, is as important as ever, if not more important now, given the world of political strife and division that we see all around us now. And, watching this movie, it taking place when it did, I mean, it was happening then, it's happening now. And it's interesting to see how people were reacting to it then versus kind of what we're seeing now. So I enjoyed it. It was a little bit too topical in a way that I wasn't expecting, but they were hitting on things that we're still talking about today, still dealing with today: class division, financial division, the haves and the have-nots. What does revolution mean to a group of people? Like, a lot of those questions are being asked in this movie, which I think is fertile ground for discussion, as it were. So, I'm kind of interested to see where this conversation goes, because I think it's going to go a lot of interesting places. But I think just at the outset, let's just kind of open this up by saying, for someone who produced the movie and co-wrote it and directed it and acted as the main character, holy shit, Warren Beatty acted the shit out of this movie, directed the shit out of this movie, wrote a fantastic script. I mean, everything about this movie in terms of technical production and actor quality is, it's astounding. It really is astounding.
Yeah, I want to say something about that. I'm somebody who, I can't remember when I didn't love film, and then now I'm getting to the age where I can't remember when I didn't study or talk about film. And it's really interesting, and Andras, you seem to probably have much more knowledge than I do on this topic, but Warren Beatty used to take up a massive amount of cultural space in our society. I mean, he was a number one star, number one filmmaker. I mean, he was, I'm trying to think of a celebrity now who was as big and it's probably wrong to say he was the Tom Cruise of his time. I don't think that speaks well for either of them, but he was a very, very important person in the history and development of film in the 70s and 80s. And now I feel he's forgotten his role in film history and some of his really great film. You just named a series, Shampoo. His film was really a breakthrough in the style of filmmaking, almost like the comedy version of The Godfather, in sort of redefining what a film comedy was. The Parallax View, before there were always conspiracy theories, but like any conspiracy theory you have today, you go back, you show that person The Parallax View, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, that's a documentary," of anything. Yeah. And then it just you may go down a list of his films. It's really remarkable, and it's all. I won't use the word sad, but it's remarkable how much he's been forgotten for somebody who made that much of an impact, and maybe this show will get some people to watch some of these movies?
Oh, well, a few things about that. First of all, we should be clear. Parallax View, although Beatty as a star exerted a certain amount of control in all of the films that he did after Bonnie and Clyde, that's an Alan J. Pakula film. But yeah, if you look at from Bonnie and Clyde, which Beatty produced, and this is how I think of Beatty as a filmmaker, is he is so committed to the idea filmmaking is a collaborative process that even though he plays multiple roles on all of his films, other than when he's the actor, as a director, like on Heaven Can Wait, he had a co-director with Buck Henry. He just liked, and on this film, on Reds, she's not credited as a writer, but Elaine May was with him through so much of it, sort of as a like a director friend who if you listen to stories from the production, she drove people crazy because she'd come in and have these crazy notes and Warren Beatty would just go with it. So he has this really deep collaborative sense as a director, which I think is part of what stands in the way of people seeing him as, there's a few things. One, a lot of times he is a filmmaker from the standpoint of being a producer, star, who hires the director, as he did with Arthur Penn in Bonnie and Clyde, or as he did with Barry Levinson on Bugsy. Both of those I think of as Warren Beatty films, where his creative stamp is totally on them, but he didn't direct them. Same thing with Shampoo. He hired Hal Ashby and they collaborated together, but clearly his stamp is all over it. And so that's, I think, one of the things that stands in the way. Also that his love life and the whole Warren Beatty is the Lothario, I think, even though that was a big part of his mythos and what gave him the power to be the star who could be the filmmaker that he was, it also sort of clouds Warren Beatty is usually first referred to as a lover or a dreamboat rather than as a director, as, with like you would with Scorsese or Spielberg or Coppola or any of the other new Hollywood filmmakers who I think of are on par with Warren Beatty. But the thing about Warren Beatty's films, and we can move on. Every Warren Beatty film where he has exerted himself as a producer is both has a strong political sense and a deeply, deeply romantic sense. And I think those, and they really also are all sort of deeply in the Hollywood tradition. And this is why he's one of my favorite filmmakers, because I don't know anyone else who has so consistently made powerfully romantic Hollywood films that are also deeply political with a sort of a leftist bent. You think of Bulworth. You get Heaven Can Wait. All of these films, there's like a very strong political subplot. There's a very strong romantic plot. And in Reds, you kind of have it all together, plus just the sort of cinematic scope of someone who has been, planning this film for decades. That's the other thing. He works very, very slow. Unlike Clint Eastwood, who will churn out a movie a year, Beatty took 5 to 10 years to make his movies. And I think they benefit from it. And I don't know if you've seen Rules Don't Apply, but his last film is all of those things. And I think it's one of his greatest, but nobody saw it.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to speak to his incredible respect, not just for himself as a star, because there's a lot of stars where you really think that all they care about is the moment they're on screen, and then they're off to their tent to talk to their agent about something. That Beatty was famous for being obsessed with everything. He had these elements of these other directors, like Kubrick. He'd redo a scene 50 times, and then Spielberg, the cinematography. Every film that he has had a part of is technically perfect. I really, if you go back and look at like any film where he had some control, and you're right, he didn't build himself up to be the auteur and fire everybody else and just be there. He was powerful, but he was willing to share. You mentioned some of the other actors, like every performance by everybody is perfect. Every camera movement is perfect. Like, if you want to learn the technique of directing actors, if you want to learn, about moving the camera and mise en scène, whatever, Like you could just go through Warren Beatty films, and by the way, they're not used in film school. Well, that's what's interesting, is that he's not a film school favorite. I'm saying that I can't speak for every film school in the world, but it is interesting to me that he checks so many boxes so successfully in what is a great movie to watch as a lover of movies and somebody who maybe like a young person wanting to be in the film industry. I've told them, I've had students ask, like, what film should, I mean, they always say Quentin Tarantino, and like, okay, if you want to watch Quentin Tarantino, just go ahead and do it. But like, watch Kurosawa, but also watch Warren Beatty movies for technical perfection. And I find it just so interesting that an actor was always pushing for that.
Yeah, well, I have a strong belief that he is sort of like, if you think of that first generation of method actors, Brando, Clift, Dean, that like Beatty comes in right at the tail end of that. His first starring role is in an Elia Kazan picture, who directed Dean and Brando, and so I think of Beatty as the extension. In a lot of ways, I feel like people talk about James Dean wanted to be a filmmaker. I feel like Beatty's career looks somewhat like you would see if James Dean had become the director, because he directs like a method actor. He's interested in exploring and in collaboration and in arguing and fighting through, like really getting, like, again, not the guy up on the top of the chair shouting, okay, move here and move there. Not like the antithesis of Hitchcock. And I think maybe that speaks to, like, it's easier to teach someone how to be Alfred Hitchcock. Just be perfect, But to teach someone how to do what Warren Beatty does, it's much harder, because it's always kind of an experiment, but he's also a total control freak. And he's only able to do this because he is one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and because he took the gamble on Bonnie and Clyde, which launched New Hollywood and just bought him decades of leeway, and he kept delivering. Like Shampoo is like, that's to me the real masterpiece. And I think you're right. Like, I've never heard anyone say that it's like what The Godfather is for drama in New Hollywood, but I think you're absolutely right. It's the great. I think it's one of the great film comedies of all time.
So I want to talk a little bit about. Thank you. I wanted to talk about the reception, the personal story of watching it in a theater as a young person, especially one obsessed with film. Again, just watching any film. This is 1981. So like, your only chance to watch a movie is to go to a theater to watch a movie. Or I happened to be going to a really great program at the University of Pennsylvania, and they had something called an analysis projector. Now, if you remember in scenes from old movies where a movie reel, the celluloid reel, would get stuck and it would start burning because the light was so bright, you really literally couldn't stop a movie in freeze frame, except with this very expensive device called an analysis projector, which had this special light bulb. So our film professors, and my first film professor was the great Amos Vogel, who founded, I think it was a cinema club in New York. He was a very famous bringing avant-garde. He wrote a book called Film as a Subversive Art, one of the key books on film. Amazing guy. And he showed us films with this analysis projector. We saw Bernardo Bertolucci's Before the Revolution, whereas this film is After the Revolution, like 100 times in 10 weeks, which is mind-blowing. But anyway, I really wanted to see this film because I was interested in epic film. And like, what did that mean to have an epic film? Because Hollywood had different definitions of it. I mean, you go back to the very earliest days of Hollywood. You have Hollywood Babylon. You have D.W. Griffith doing Intolerance, which is, a version of it is available today. And The White Elephants, come from that. He's filming 3 separate movies about intolerance through the ages and gigantic sets from Babylon. It's amazing. So Hollywood, from its earliest days, was spending money to film these large-scale movies with a cast of thousands. That used to be a phrase, come see this movie, a cast of thousands. And remember that these were all practical effects. Like, I mean, literally when the Israelites walked across the desert, no CGI. They had to hire 10,000 people to be Israelites and film it in the desert. So when you went to an epic movie, I want to say, I really score in that the definition was that on the screen, you would see things where you go, that's astonishing that they were able to do that. Whereas today, honestly, any student can create special effects where you go, okay, that, good CGI there. But like back in the day, it had to be there. Like somebody had to have had a camera in front of all those people. And so he had conquered all these other genres. I mean, that's the other thing about Beatty. I think maybe his problem, like in being famous, is that he moved from genre to genre, right? he did one, check, moved on to the next one. He didn't like Hitchcock made the same film. He was a great filmmaker, but he basically made the same movie over and over again in terms of like his style and things. You just instantly recognizable. Whereas Beatty always was restless and wanted to try something new. So this was his attempt at an epic. And I have to tell you, in the theater, it was 7/8 of an epic. And we can talk about this, but like you said that, Chris, that some of these things like seemed fresh to you. Most of them did. Some of them, the scene where he's trying to escape on one of those push carts for railways, a couple of scenes there looked pretty derivative because he was coming out after David Lean had made Dr. Zhivago. And David Lean, famously, Hollywood said that when David Lean died, he took the secret of making epic movies with him. And so that was a big deal to come out with a movie with like scenes of Russia and snowstorms and things like that. And I do feel that he was mostly successful, but in 1981, some of the I really should go back, but if you go back to the reviews, it was like great effort, A for effort, always A for effort. Like Warren Beatty, always A for effort, but like didn't quite pull off making an original epic movie. That was just my feeling in the theater in 1981, respecting all these other things that I saw.
I'm curious. Can I ask you? Because I didn't watch it in the theater, and at that time, and my political awareness was not much at that time. But I think just the fact of a Hollywood movie that was so thoughtful about American communists is. I mean, I guess you could put it in with like The Way We Were and The Front, but I think that there's something like this is kind of one of the things that I also think is amazing about Warren Beatty is that because of his movie stardom and whatever charisma he has, he gets, I don't know, capitalists to give him huge amounts of money to do the kind of projects that they'd never give a young, interesting filmmaker the money to do. Like somehow Warren Beatty gets to make these political films. And so I think when you're talking about, I think just the sheer fact of making that movie on that topic does make it a unique epic. I mean, like maybe cinematically, you're right. He probably does lean a bit. But I think also that's not like Warren Beatty's strength as a filmmaker isn't his cinematic vision. I think it's like his gestalt vision of like, can I get all of these people together to deliver this thing? And, and I think also the love story, like maybe what do you think about this? Do you feel like, because I feel like that's the epic part. It's almost like it's a very small movie about politics and a huge movie about love.
Well, see, I'm not sure. I think I agree with parts of what you're saying. And again, I'm just giving my 18-year-old self, his version, which is maybe not what if I'd gone to the theater to see it. I mean, nobody goes to the theater apparently anymore. But like, if this film came out today and I went there, Chris and I were texting before this, and we talked about the old philosophical observation that you never dip your hand into the same river. Well, you never see the same movie twice, and you never see the same movie once, right? Because where you are in life, what you've experienced. 1981, this was still Soviet Union was there, right? And it was writing its own history. I remember an interview with Warren Beatty that he gave, and I don't remember with what, but he talked about Trotsky. Now, this is the bravery, right? Because, they were doing movies about Russia. Like they would be a World War II movie with Russia, and like they would be a Cold War movie. But the esoterica of the Russian Revolution was pretty much forgotten in the West as something within non-specialists by 1981. And then in the Soviet Union, the history had been rewritten 5 or 6 times, depending who was in power. Stalin had rewritten history completely during the 1930s, and almost all the I'm putting this in air quotes here, the heroes that we see in the movie were gone and purged and dead long before the end of the World War II. And then he in his interview he talked about Trotsky and how with some of the opening up of the Soviet Union at that time, that maybe Trotsky, one of the other revolutionaries because at the time it was Lenin and Trotsky were the two most famous globally. If you look at I study political propaganda. If you look at cartoons in the 1920s about the Russian Revolution, Stalin was a minor flunky in the hinterlands. Nobody knew who Stalin was until much, much later. He was the dull gray bureaucrat, who eventually took over. But up through most of the 20s, the stars of the movie, the USSR, were Trotsky and Lenin. So he was trying to sort of retell a history. Then John Reed, also somebody, probably one of the great journalists of all time in terms of his actual impact, like writing about things that were happening in front of him. So it was a wonderful movie for people who are interested in history and interested in diving into an understanding of history. I felt the love story, and maybe this was just me, I felt the love story got in the way. I almost felt like somebody told him to have a love story. Sometimes you're watching, especially American films, and there's like an alien invasion, but like two people find time to make love or something like that. It felt inserted there, and I know that shouldn't be. But I'm giving you 18-year-old me who wanted to let's have more big scenes and battles and things like that. And I'm not necessarily interested in nuzzling on the screen.
I think that's what's so interesting about the relationships, the romances in his films, is a lot of them. I mean, this is one of the things I've had many arguments about this with people. I consider Warren Beatty to be a really strongly feminist filmmaker. A lot of women disagree with me on this, probably just because, and I think somewhat because of his reputation. But the issue is the way that the female characters, like Diane Keaton's character, Louise Bryant in this, is not a nuzzler. They're wrestling with very serious issues of like power dynamics between men and women that we're still working on today. Again, I think this film maybe it's selling the previous generation short to say that it might be received even more presciently now than it was then. Because I think it makes a really good point. There's a point in the movie where Henry Miller's like, yeah, we were fucking as much back then as we do now.
It's more perverted now.
You're arguing with 18-year-old me, and you're going to win that argument.
Okay, well, maybe,
but I'm just giving you the impression that it's so hard to pull off the small story within the epic tale. I mean, it's just very, very difficult, and it's just. I'm telling you how 18-year-old me just like, okay, all right, that's interesting.
Well,
now
I don't
keep
want
going.
to take on kid.
I will say, though, in terms of kind of to maybe split the difference between the two of you, I think if we talk about post the intermission of the film, Diane Keaton is sidelined, essentially just showing up in establishing shots and scenes where it's like she's on the trail of Warren Beatty. She's trying to get to Russia. And if anything, I feel like Diane Keaton is underserved in the second half of the movie. I will say, look, as someone who's a huge fan of Diane Keaton, primarily because of her role in Annie Hall, I loved her in this movie, but I do kind of think they gave it a lot of screen time in the first half of the movie, and then in the second half of the movie, they kind of realized there's something else here that we're going to talk about, and the movie, I think, pivots away from her character And it kind of feels like, well, she seemed like a big part of the narrative until the intermission, and then she's just kind of going after Warren Beatty. So I feel it's just it's not that it's inserted as much for me, but it's underserved in the second half of the movie, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, see, I just feel like I'm not sure that that's my experience. I think it's an interesting flip. Like, it's more like he becomes the damsel in distress,
right?
And she becomes the hero who travels all this way to find the dying her dying bride or the dying bride thing. And and to me, one of the best parts, I don't want to say there's so many great things in the movie, but one of my favorite things in the movie, and I think it passes the Bechdel test, is when Maureen Stapleton, Emma Goldman has been so critical of Louise Bryant for the whole time. And then when they meet and have that reconciliation where she says she was wrong about her, it's such a great cathartic moment for both of those characters. So I know when it gets into the epic and it gets into the Russian Revolution, there's not a lot for Louise Bryant to do at that point. We're not, unless, but even like all of her stuff of getting, like, there's something a hero's journey in what she's doing. And again, I think this is clever Warren Beatty, the feminist strand of his filmmaking, seeing this opportunity to make himself, and he does this a lot. Like, he downplays his masculinity in some really, really interesting ways as a filmmaker, the way he uses Warren Beatty, the star. And in this case, I think that's one of the things that he's doing here is making himself the weak sister, or the girl character, and her into the hero who travels across the mountains to save him, which he can't do.
Yeah, I want to talk about Jerzy Kosinski and the witnesses, because let's go to the witnesses first, because that was a much criticized negatively aspect of the film, the insertion of these people. I just remember critical discussion at the time. I think the New York Times review mentioned it. I think Siskel and I'm not sure they were reviewing that, but there was something really off. And I never, again, I was 18. I hadn't watched enough movies to know what I didn't like about it. But I think partly was I understood the point was that these were real people, that this was a real story, that these were not just cardboard cutouts, literally signs being held in Red Square, that type of thing. But I didn't see what they added except that they existed. I mean, that line about they were effing each other, it seemed like a mixture of genres that just didn't, as sitting there in the audience, I didn't get it. Again, this is 18-year-old me, although I'm not sure whether much older me would have made that decision. Now, to the personal life, Jerzy Kosinski, famous novelist, wrote this memoir, which turned out to be slightly more of a novel. The Painted Bird stars in the film as a Russian revolutionary, right? Am I remembering the right film here? Yeah. So he has a line that I've quoted because it's a really important line about careers and like life. And he says, "In Russia today, the personal life is dead." Right? Am I right on that quote?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to make sure this wasn't from Battlestar Galactica, and I just misplaced the quoters like that. But so that's Warren Beatty, to me, always argued for humanity. I mean, you mentioned politics, and absolutely, Warren Beatty had a political point of view, but he always struck me as essentially arguing for a humanistic point of view. That like, we can't get so caught up in the party line, and this is what the party said. And John Reed was that kind of a journalist, too. He was very George Orwell-like, not Orwellian, but George Orwell-like. George Orwell was very famous for fighting in the Spanish Civil War on the leftist side, on the national government side against the evil fascists, then coming home and writing Homage to Catalonia, a very negative book about the leftist side and all the infighting and the party politics that undermined the anti-fascist cause. And this character, Jerzy Kosinski, there as the person who just, revolution is all they care about. That they've forgotten what the revolution was for, allegedly, was to make life better for people. By the way, I take this personally because my grandfather, I know nothing about the circumstances, but my grandfather came to America, my father's father, in 1919 from somewhere, which would either be called Poland, Ukraine, Germany, or Russia today, or Belarus, to escape from the Russian Civil War. To some extent, all the sides had agreed to kill the Jews. Just some were doing it more than others. But the Russian Civil War was one of the most bitter civil wars in history. Millions have died, typhus, starvation, but also just no prisoners, no quarter. And it produced these people who were just so soulless. And I think Warren Beatty was making a movie about these evil, soulless people, and he tried to be a champion of humanity and felt that's where the revolution had gone wrong, is that it lost its humanity. So I think that message, through the personal story, got through. Chris, you articulated much better than I did this idea of what role, if you just completely edited out Diane Keaton and just had a movie about John Reed and his experiences in Russia, I don't know whether you'd have a better or worse movie, but I felt she was underused there. But Warren Beatty argued for the humanity of revolutions, which in 1981, and I'd say in 2020, 24, still needs to be argued.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's part of why the testimonials are important. I think 1981 is still very, very close to the blacklists, and which there really was never a full-on reckoning with them. I mean, I guess there were reckonings in cinema, and there were little flare-ups when people would reference it, or when they would honor Elia Kazan at the Oscars, or different. But I think that's the sort of one of the courageous things about this is him taking these folks who were blacklisted, who lived through this time, and saying that these are very much real people, talking about people they really knew. I guess that documentary aspect of it is part of. It's funny, I wasn't aware that it was critically judged harshly critically at the time, but for me, I think that's one of the things that is really strong about it. Well, there's so much that's strong about it, but one of the things that makes the film special and makes it different than Dr. Zhivago or Lawrence of Arabia or these other epics is that it does feel like revolutionary in its own as a project, because it has these revolutionaries or former revolutionaries, real people who lived and died through this. Also the sense that these elders are not going to be with us very much longer to tell the story, and to put them front and center in this massive Hollywood film. I don't know.
Anders, I wonder though, I'm going to flip what you just said, just for the purpose of getting Chris excited here about this podcast. So I'm going to vociferously argue. By 1981, we were mostly aware about the Gulag Archipelago. We were mostly aware the revolution was betrayed very, very early, that the Soviet Union had become a nightmare much earlier. It wasn't Lenin had this wonderful, beautiful revolution and this evil Stalin came along and ruined it. It was, I think the current scholarship is the Soviet Union was a death state from the very beginning, with just ruthlessness and killing its enemies or anybody who was suspected being an enemy very early. And there was no reckoning in the American left on that. There's a book of my generation, or my parents' generation, was a very important one. Irving Howe was a great American scholar, writer, social critic, and he wrote this massive book that was a huge bestseller called World of Our Fathers. It was about the Jewish immigration that my grandfather participated in from the late 1890s through the 1920s, which were the majority of American Jews. That's when
my great-grandfather might have been on the same boat with yours.
Yeah, that's right. From Minsk, east of Pinsk, or something like that. It used to be a Borscht Belt joke there. So there's a footnote in there It's like an 800-page book, but I remember a footnote most where an American Jewish leftist newspaper editor in New York meets an old friend from Russia who came in the late 1920s. And remember, the Russian Revolution had good press in the left, in the British left, the Western left, up through the 30s. Even then, even through the 30s, Trotsky, all the purges, Trotsky leaves, he writes The Revolution Betrayed. He starts saying, Stalin is this evil, satanic figure who's killing millions. A lot of leftists don't want to listen to him. They don't want to hear about it. So in this footnote, there's this lunch between these two people, old comrades, and the one who comes from Russia says, it sucks. I'm sorry, the revolution has been betrayed. All the ideals we believed in have been destroyed. It's an evil state, and the American leftist just doesn't want to believe it. And so it's interesting to me that there's not a reckoning with the Hollywood blacklist, but there was never a reckoning in the American left, which held on to its glorification of the Soviet Union. World War II sort of, made everybody try to ignore the problems of the Soviet Union long enough to defeat Nazi Germany. But I think Warren Beatty was a smart enough intellectual and a smart enough filmmaker that he was questioning the whole idea of historical memory. I don't think he was saying the witnesses always. I mean, we know eyewitness testimony is the worst testimony, right? And people remembering their war stories or their revolution stories can be the least accurate people. So I think he made a great movie about memory and history and sort of how we think about memory and history, among other things.
I think when I was kind of alluding to contemporary flourishes, I think for me, when I was watching this movie, all I could think was, wow, Warren Beatty really made a epic with a Ken Burns documentary just kind of in there. And I think to your point, Andras, like if you were to show this to someone now, I think it plays better contemporary with those witnesses in it, because not only do they essentially talk you out of the movie at the end, they kind of talk through the credits, and it kind of they're the ones who shepherd you out of the film, but they're the ones who kind of also bring you into the movie. And I mean, in a lot of ways, they're used as transitionary scenes, which is, again, like, I think it's so novel and it's so smart. And I think it just goes back to this idea of Warren Beatty as I guess we could say auteur. I think really like the collaborative nature of what he was doing comes through because again, he's directing a film that he's starring in, didn't want to star in the movie initially, but you would think if he's directing a movie with himself in it, he's going to want to be on screen all the time. And he gives up plenty of time to, like we've already alluded to, an older generation who probably isn't going to get to share their story in this large of a setting at any other point. And I think that adds to the value of the film now in terms of it being like a necessary watch for modern audiences, because again, like you both have alluded to, it gets to the idea of when we talk about history, we're using the facts that we have now, and sometimes those facts aren't the best available facts. And that just happens with distance from a thing, with more time to chew on it or interpret it or analyze it. I mean, again, there's things that have happened in our lifetime that people are just now starting to write books and come to terms with. So I think it's interesting because, again, to both of your points, they look in. The only class they taught anything about the October Revolution was world history in this country. They don't teach shit about anything else. You have to go out of your way to go learn it in this country. If you want to learn about anything that happened anywhere else other than here, you have to go out of your way to learn it. And when they teach U.S. history, they don't talk about any of this. They don't talk about anything that this movie talks about, because again, it is so much of our political party system and the way that they've worked in this country, worked in air quotes, is told by the people who are in charge. And that's what part of this movie is about, is when the people in charge aren't good faith actors, what does that mean? And this is what I mean. Again, look, nobody sits and says the Russian Revolution was a great thing. Like, again, good, bad. That's not for me to say, and I don't think that there's any one answer there. But I think what's interesting is Warren Beatty isn't necessarily interested in demonizing anybody. He's interested in just kind of presenting it as matter-of-factly as possible and saying, look, this is what was going on. This is how people went about doing it. And someone like John Reed getting caught up in it, you can see why. It makes perfect sense. I mean, revolutions are at their best when everybody is on the same page and moving in a similar direction. And the moment people meet something that splits them is when you see what happens with this, where all of a sudden nothing is in good faith and all we care about is, did we get the approval of the real communists or not? And it's like, what the fuck are we doing here? Like, you see it. It's just like, what the fuck are we doing here? Like, why the fuck do we care about any of this? And I ask myself that now, looking at where we are. It's like, who cares if you bend a fucking knee for someone? That's not what any of this has ever been or should have been about. And I like that even in 1981, Warren Beatty is making a case for take a step back, look at what's going on, and be mindful of the way the situation is playing out. Because again, I think that that's what Warren Beatty brings to this movie is no demonization. It's more of just, all the Jerzy Kosinski stuff is just very matter of fact. He's like, look, my kid had typhus last year. You didn't see me making excuses for not being here. The revolution is my life. And the question then becomes, what does that mean? And if you can't answer what that means, what have you given your life to? And that whole conversation, the back and forth between Warren Beatty and Jerzy Kosinski in the third act of the film, it just cuts to the core of the idea of this movie is what happens when you lose sight of what you were initially going to revolution for to begin with.
Yeah. It's this, what you're getting at brings me to a distinction I wanted to get into when we were talking about the Russian Revolution, because I feel like there's sort of two different pieces of this. One is the actual Russian Revolution, and one is about American communists, many of whom had nothing to do. Like in the film, this is like the American Communist Party, people who were avowed, communists who were devoted to that cause. But the people who were labeled as communists, and it's not the Hollywood blacklist, it's, academics were schools were purged of communist sympathizers, which could be code for homosexual or swarthy or sympathetic to integration, or like there's so many, or a woman who was promiscuous. There are so many people who got labeled as communists by the time we get to, and it's still happening in 1981. That's the Reagan Revolution. You still have that weaponized against people who have nothing to do with the Russian Revolution. So I feel like there's two strands we need to talk about when we're talking about that, which is one, the sort of the American left at that time's infatuation with the Russian Revolution, and the sort of weaponization of the term communist aimed at anyone on the left in the United States post World War II, which is it's after the scope of this film, but I feel like is in the scope of what Warren Beatty is trying to say, is that between World War II and 1981, there's been so much propaganda that we can't even think about what the Russian Revolution was. And I think that it's sort of coming up in our conversation, like all of your critiques of the Soviet state and what it became are absolutely valid. And at the same time, I stand arm in arm with the people in the United States who were accused of being communist just because they gave money to, the Communist Party, who were the only ones who were fighting lynching in the South in the, in the 30s and 40s. So you get that.
I realize I made a mistake, but I think it's a mistake that shows a significant aspect of watching this movie. The Jerzy Kosinski character, who's this really ruthless, dedicated, revolutionary bureaucrat, I quoted him saying, in Russia, the personal life is dead. And then I realized, no, that was the Pasha character, who was the dedicated, soulless revolutionary in David Lean's Dr. Zhivago. And I think this was my problem. I guess my problem was I was a film buff, even at a young age. And I just felt like Warren Beatty didn't have enough new things to put in this movie to me. There were things that I just had seen in movies before in 1981. And I think that was one of the struggles that I felt watching it was to me, it was a great package, but it had some derivative details in there. And of course, we're always going to have the discussion about like, there's no original stories, right? I mean, everything is a retelling of something else. But when you're making a movie, like just let's imagine, I'm sure some young would-be filmmakers and creative artists listen to this podcast, right? And you're thinking like, gosh, I want to do an alien invasion movie. How do I do an alien invasion movie that just doesn't look like every single other invasion? How do I do a romantic comedy? How do I do anything? I mean, you could just sit back and say, well, I won't make anything. That's the most creative act, is to do nothing. Because, I mean, I haven't heard your album yet, but like, people have done albums before, right? There've been podcasts before. So I want to go back to the A for effort, that Warren Beatty tried to do all of these great things that sometimes it just felt a little forced in the execution, or it just didn't quite, he reached for the stars and he didn't make it sometimes. That's not a negative thing that you're reaching for the stars and you hit the moon instead of Alpha Centauri, but not everybody does it every time. So great film, but certain elements that felt in 1981 repetitive of things I'd seen before.
Yeah, I could totally see that.
And I think, Andras, to your point, and to kind of the point that you were talking about, Dr. Perlmutter, like, even now, the usage of the term communism is a dog whistle, right? Like, we hear it all the time. I mean, one of the most recent candidates that, again, didn't get a fair shake, and I think wasn't given a fair shake because the term communist and socialist were being bandied about with such fervor that it would be hard to not get caught up in it if you're of a certain predilection, was Bernie Sanders. And I mean, again, like, it's the idea of, you hear the term, whose mouth it's coming out of means a certain thing, and it effectively means they do not understand the definition of the word, but they're going to use it to mean whatever they want. And this movie is talking less about what you're addressing, Andras, which is the use of communism to just mean you might be gay, you might be this, you might be that, you don't jive with the rest of society, or at least the way I want society to be. The McCarthyism of the last, century, where we had to deal with people being blacklisted and things like that. I mean, it's an old tradition that goes as far back as the Salem witch trials. You don't like somebody. You want something. They have land that you want. Oh my, she's a witch. I saw her do something. Oh, their land gets taken away because they got stoned to death. Would be a shame if I just went and bought their land. And that, again, that like demonization and the usage of, again, at the time, that would be supernatural ideas. At this time, it's political ideas and political dog whistling. I find it interesting that when Warren Beatty makes this film, he's not doing any of that, which could have been, and in a lot of ways, I mean, in 1981, we're right on the cusp of something like Red Dawn, which exists literally to make people angry about the USSR. And look, they're invading our country. Now what? And to your point, Andras, about like there needs to be this distinction made. I mean, I think even now the distinction needs to be made, because I think the term communist and socialist, I think if you ask someone who's using it all the time, they wouldn't have a fucking clue what the definition is, and they don't care, and that's okay. And if they were to watch something like this, I'm not saying it's okay, they're saying it's okay to not know. If they were to watch something like this, they'd be like, oh, okay, now I actually see what this means. But I don't think anybody who's using communism and fascism as a term in terms of it being a dog whistle in 2024 would be bothered to watch a movie with dialogue as well written as this movie, let alone a movie that is not just what is the cinematic equivalent of farts and grunting. So, I mean, again, I understand that we live in a time and a place where anybody can watch anything, but they're not making movies like this anymore is not really a phrase I would use for this movie, because nobody really makes movies like this, taking to task and going about actually having a conversation about.
Well, I want to ask you both this question because you're more qualified to answer it. Like, there was an old Hollywood view, and I'm old enough to have held it, that the epic movie died years ago, and no one has been able to pull off an epic movie into traditional old Hollywood way. I mean, they can throw $300 million at the screen, but I'm not a violent person, but like if you tell me The Dial of Destiny was an epic movie just because it had $300 million behind it, I'm just going to disagree with you. Was Reds the last attempt at a traditional epic movie? Because now we use the term epic. It's a buzzword for the budget, not the look or the feel.
What did you think about Dunkirk?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's no question that Christopher Nolan is this big. Everyone agrees he's like the exception in Hollywood. Like he can make original IP, or not use the word IP. It tells you how much I've declined as appreciation of cinema. But yeah, I mean, where is Dunkirk now? I mean, it just
I feel like that's sort of emerged sort of the same way that Zodiac emerged as the Fincher film that everyone agrees is the one.
And thank you, Andras, by the way, for that. You said it. I didn't have to.
Is sort of rising in the Christopher Nolan is just sort of like, it's a little bit subtler. It's a little bit more serious. It's a little bit more austere. I feel like, and there was another one I was thinking of that was, it's funny when I'm thinking about epics now, I'm thinking about No Country for Old Men is not really like an epic in the same sense, but it has a scope to, I guess I'm thinking of films that have massive scope. Saving Private Ryan, big, even though they're using, and all of these, they're using CGI, and that's going to take away from, you're not going to get Lawrence of Arabia,
I don't know though, because if I were to throw my hat into the ring for an answer, the Lord of the Rings films, I think are I think it goes back to to a point you might have been making, Andras, or kind of alluding to, and to answer your question, which is it's not really this kind of epic that gets made. It's a genre epic now. Like I'm sure, like you alluded to, Dr. Perlmutter, like there are people that would consider Star Wars: The Force Awakens an epic sci-fi film. Yeah, it's like I'm not.
Okay, I'm leaving now. Okay, goodbye. That's it. I'm done, Chris. I will never speak to you again or appear in this podcast. Click.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I'm not willing to
unsubscribe.
I'm not willing to go there with that because I don't agree with that. But I think that in terms of what we need out of the term epic and epic filmmaking, the grandiose nature of the filmmaking process needs to be evident in the final product. I think that's, for me, what an epic needs to be now. And it's like, I think to your point, like No Country for Old Men, the storytelling feels very elevated. I would say an epic that came out. Look, I wasn't even the biggest fan of it. I enjoyed it more than the first one. I think Dune, the two Dune films, pretty big epics, but again, sci-fi films, big in terms of CGI. Now, again, the filmmaking, pretty epic filmmaking. I mean, they're doing all this stuff in the desert. I would say pretty good example, Mad Max Fury Road, Furiosa, both epics in terms of scope.
Mad Max Fury Road should qualify as an epic.
I think it qualifies more than a lot of things that have come out in the last 25 years that people just consider offhand epics.
I want to toss the question back because I have I'm curious just to get a sense on what we're talking about when we say epics. So would the Sergio Leone Westerns, like particularly like Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Once Upon a Time in the West, would those qualify in your mind as epics?
I always felt an epic was something you felt that you couldn't really have a checklist of, because you would end up with a lot of movies where somebody spent the money and cast the number of people trying to pull off an epic, but it wasn't epic. And I'm trying to defend something that I don't have just an absolute clear definition of. I don't think any of the movies that you've named qualify for me as epic, but I don't have a good argument of why they don't. Part of it is a getting of this, that there is a wider world, a world event going on beyond the characters on the screen. And by the way, Saving Private Ryan, one of the great movies ever made, and in my appreciation. And certainly the opening scenes there you can have an epic scene in a non-epic movie. And I think actually, to me, that to Spielberg's credit, he said, okay, we're going to start out with the wide angle, and say, okay, this is part of it. In fact, that was part of the story. Like, wait a minute, there's this world-changing event. This will define the future of the human race for 1,000 years. And we're supposed to care about this one guy after all of these people are killed. And then he spends the rest of the film trying to make the case about why you should care about the life of one person, right? Mm-hmm. So he went from epic and then to close up, right? But I wouldn't necessarily classify it as an epic movie for the whole runtime. So I think that's and your point, Chris, about genre, yeah. I when I saw Lawrence of Arabia, not in the theater. I mean, in a rerun in the theater, but I was too young to see it released. And then Dr. Zhivago in a theater, I felt like they were genreless. There was no Russian revolutionary romance genre, here somebody's another film, or there was no, desert combat genre. And some of the epic film. I mean, there was a Bible. There was certainly the Cecil B. DeMille, epic. He was a one-man epic maker. But you've all made really good points. I didn't feel it. I feel, the character Hesh in The Sopranos, when he's just listening to music and he says, "It's not a hit. I just don't feel it," and that's all he has to say. I'm sorry.
And I'm kind of and that's the thing. Andras, I would say, in my approximation, those movies are, but I completely understand where you're coming from, Dr. Perlmutter, because at the same time, for me, an epic is kind of an indefinable quality about it. There's something about it that just feels like it's taken one step further. There are plenty of mobster films and mafia films, but I think we would agree The Godfather is an epic mafia film. And again, it's not a world-changing event in any stretch of the imagination. It's really kind of just this one family and what they've been doing and what they're kind of...
I don't know, the Cuban Revolution's in there. It's a world-changing event.
But I don't think that...
In part two. I mean, that's what's interesting. I'm old enough to have seen on TV, and I guess you can get it somewhere, the complete Godfather saga, where they re-edited
where they put the two together. Yeah, I saw that.
And that was epic in scope. But remember, in the first film, you don't get any flashbacks to,
right,
Palermo, to Sicily or whatever. It's all told when it certainly had a scope of New York, and then all the things going on.
So you don't think The Godfather is an epic?
It was. It was.
You're
of a kind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it became more one. So in Saving Private Ryan, you had to go from widescreen to close up. I would argue as the Godfather films progressed, you got wider screen.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. I mean, about so many of these things is even with an example like Fury Road and Furiosa. I mean, Fury Road is an epic, and then Furiosa in its own right is an epic, but it kind of opens that view up because Fury Road is just a chase movie. Now, to say it's just a chase movie is to undersell.
I'm going to argue here. Explain this to me. I understand post-apocalyptic Australia only has one color tone and everything, but couldn't he have moved one of those films to a jungle or something like that? I mean, you're saying these are epic movies, but they're all on the same set.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, again, I think the definition of what an epic is does. I think it's not the least defined thing I've done on the show, but I mean, I think we'd all agree Ben-Hur is an epic, right? The original Ben-Hur is an epic film. I mean,
the original or the one that with Charlton Heston?
The one with Charlton Heston. What about, would you consider Gone with the Wind an epic?
And Gone with the Wind as much as possible.
Yeah, Fair. Gone with the Wind was one of the top 10 Hollywood. I mean, and again, let's just talk about cinematography here. Again, one hiring great people, as you said, Andras, is one of the strengths of Warren Beatty. The camera work always shows through, right? I mean, I felt I'm drifting now, but I feel like there's something about the wide shots of an epic where you see something that like you haven't seen before, or maybe in Gone with the Wind, you have one of the most famous pullbacks in cinema history, where you're looking at a few wounded soldiers and you pull back and you see Atlanta burning, right? And again, you're going like, wow, they put all that on the screen, without like 500 people in front of computers. And so I completely agree with everything you've said, that other films have come out that have epic scope and feel within particular. It's interesting. They're all, as you said, Chris, within particular genres. Can we have a non-genre epic?
Well, that's that's the real question. And then the other question I have is, can you have an epic film that's an hour and a half long? Because that's the other thing. Like, all the movies that we've talked about that we can agree are epics
No, you got to have an intermission. If you don't have okay, that's it. I have a definition now. You must have an intermission. I just was showing my younger daughter. She hasn't seen Cleopatra, the Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor. Epic, truly epic. The scene where Cleopatra enters Rome.
Right.
Supposedly, like the most money ever spent on one scene or something like that. I don't know about that, but like, okay. My new definition is it has to have an intermission, or it's not an epic.
Okay, The Hateful Eight's an epic.
That's the thing. Is Inglourious Basterds an epic? Like, I mean,
I want to fill in a couple of things. So when we're talking about cinematography on this film, we're talking about Vittorio Storaro, who other films he did all of Warren Beatty's films basically. After that he had done. He did Bulworth. He did Dick Tracy. He also worked with Coppola, worked with Elaine May, Bertolucci, and several late-era Woody Allen films.
Say our dear friend Mr. Woody Allen there recently.
Including his newest, Coup de Chance. So I want to go... I kind of want to get back to talking about Reds, because this conversation about epics seems like it could be its own podcast. But I am curious, like, when you say that Dr. Zhivago is a genreless film, or that Lawrence of Arabia, I mean, they're basically, sort of historical romances. And I mean, I think it's when you're talking about the scope, it transcends genre. It's why I would say that Once Upon a Time in the West is an epic, and in a way that like High Noon is definitely not, or Gunfight at the OK Corral is definitely not, but maybe The Searchers is. And I think it has to do with the scope of cinema you're going for. And I think one of the reasons we probably wouldn't have it now is that nobody sees, you're not watching for scope. You're not going into a whole other world where there's this massive screen in front of you, and the film is supposed to transport the majority of the audience that way. Now, everyone is stopping their films. Like, I wish we had projectors that would burn the film when people stop it. In
1981, if you were a filmmaker, you knew the audience would be encountering your film.
Yes.
In this giant screen. I say screen because, nowadays people have, 200-inch 4K screens, and with 90 speakers, Lucas THX sound or something like that. That's pretty amazing. I've been in some great home theaters. Maybe you living in Los Angeles, you live in Los Angeles, you have access to more great home theaters. But like, it's still not being in a theater in 1981 and knowing this is your only chance. And the filmmaker knowing that this is going to be the only encounter. There's going to be no piracy. 1981. Why would somebody? How could somebody pirate a film? No place to show it, right? Okay. So I also have a feel that the people who made the film were making it for the big screen. He wasn't thinking, one day this will be shown on VHS or what. Just didn't occur to them. That they had to worry about the streaming audience or the subscriptions or something.
Well, and when everything was being done practically in 1981, and like you have alluded to, the idea that you can't see it anywhere else, you can see everything. Everything comes out in the wash if you're watching it on a big screen in 1981. And I do think it comes through in the movie. I mean, what's interesting is, in a lot of ways, I think the epic nature of the movie, I mean, for me, obviously, that's why we're talking about it this month. It's kind of the lead in this month to a whole lot of other things. But in terms of it being like an epic, it is kind of not small in scope, but it's the big moments aren't the big moments I was expecting from an epic. It's very different. And I think that speaks to, again, Warren Beatty wanting to do something different with this idea of an epic film and to tell it from the perspective of a journalist who's in it and then who's a kind of watching it and then becomes in it by choice and by design. I think that again, it's a weird movie in a lot of ways because it's navigating what's going on in a way that is like what you've alluded to, Dr. Perlmutter, like it comes very close in on what's going on. It's not necessarily about all of it holistically, but about John Reed and what he gets himself into in terms of all the other things that are going on. I mean, we see Lennon several times. We see Warren Beatty interacting with Lennon, but we never get a scene with Lennon where they're talking to one another and we get to see Lennon as a character. I think that speaks to the idea here of like, we only see as much as John Reed is privy to, which I like that as well. It makes the story feel like we are experiencing it in real time with him. And maybe that's part of what epics are, is seeing these big things as they're playing out for real. I mean, there are plenty of movies that have D-Day as part of the movie, if not a thing that's alluded to by the other characters. Very rarely do we see it happening. And in terms of the Russian Revolution, there aren't a lot of movies out there that are going at it the way this movie goes about it.
Yeah, but see, Chris, you said something really crucial there about the movie we were expecting. Okay, so John Reed wrote a book, 10 Days That Shook the World, which was a sensation. I mean, I've actually read the book 15 years ago, but it's a really, as a journalism professor, it's a great work of journalism. Like, it was an extremely competently exciting written book. It was a national, sensational, international bestseller. I expected to see Sergei Eisenstein's 10 Days That Shook the World. So Sergei Eisenstein, probably the most famous and accomplished filmmaker to come out of the Soviet Union, at least the early decades of the Soviet Union, probably most famous for Alexander Nevsky and the Battle of the Ice. He directs a film called October. If you talk about documentary, if you watch any documentary today about the Russian Revolution, by the way, remember there were two Russian revolutions. The Communist Revolution was overthrowing the democratic government. They weren't overthrowing the Tsar. That was the second revolution. So when we talk about the Russian Revolution, they were the ones who overthrew the democracy, the communists. But he made this film called October. And if you watch any documentary today, his shot scenes of a film about the October Revolution, the second revolution, are so realistic. You know, they're black and white and they're jerky. You know, they're the code for what, documentary footage looks like, that they're used as documentary footage. I've seen that over and over again when they say, and then, Lenin led the revolution, cut to scenes from Sergei Eisenstein's October, which were not from the real revolution. They were films from a movie. So when Warren Beatty is making Reds, part of what because I'd taken a film class, I'd taken a Russian history class, whatever. I sort of expected to have these gigantic scenes of 50,000 communists storming the Winter Palace, or something like that. And again, I give him credit for sort of not doing the easy thing. I guess it would have been the easy thing to remake Sergei Eisenstein's. I mean, I think those two films should be on the same double header. There's like sister films, and of course, one is no longer seen except in clips. But I guess, Anders, tell me, was Beatty trying to not do something that was expected with the big scenes, with the big the 10,000 Israelites stuff? He had power, right? He could have said, I need 10,000 guys dressed as communist revolutionaries to storm the Winter Palace. He would have gotten the money to do it.
There are so many stories of ways that they just they burned through money, or like they would change out a whole bunch of extra. Yeah. So they spare no expense. I think it's the thing to really understand Warren Beatty as a filmmaker. All of his films, every single one of them is a romance. It is a romance, and it is political. It's not like he makes political films that have a love story in them, or love stories that have a political side thing. They are both. And they're all like, from Bonnie and Clyde is a full-on love story. And the love story is as great, is as solid and complex and interesting. The movie could just be about that. But then there are also bank robbers, and they're bank robbers during the Depression, and they're going so it becomes this political story, which, I mean, it's, if you think about it, Bonnie and Clyde is going on a little bit after Reds, but it's the same. He's dealing with the same issues. And by the time he gets to Rules Don't Apply, he's dealing with Howard Hughes and anti-communist politics there. I mean, in Bulworth, it's the love story is right at the top, and it's also a deeply political story. So I think that's the way you kind of have to look at Reds, is if it's an epic love story that takes place during the Russian Revolution, and it seeks to teach us about the Russian Revolution, and it is very thoughtful. You can say he's a deeply intellectual filmmaker. There's a lot of ideas in this and a lot of historical context, but it starts with Louise Bryant meeting John Reed and their complex relationship, which moves through it's like a triptych of that time, and we encounter all these amazing people, and then it leads into, like, again, I argue with the idea that she's sidelined because she doesn't have a lot of lines in the second half, because I feel like she is the one he's losing himself in the revolution.
Right.
And she is holding that through line of the revolution matters, but we matter. And I think that's kind of what Warren Beatty is saying in all of his films, is the robbery matters, but the love story is why we're doing the robbery.
Right.
The Bulworth is ranting against the insurance companies, and he's rapping, but he's doing that because Halle Berry blew his fucking mind. Julie Christie is this, like, she's the environmental activist in Heaven Can Wait, and she's the reason that his character basically can't live the life of this millionaire that he was given. It's on over and over again, and I feel like I think that's also one of the reasons we go back to why Warren Beatty is not. I think we have a lot more respect for Murder, like for Scorsese, or for a certain kind of like straight ahead historical drama, the way that Spielberg does, that we don't have for love stories. Love stories, it's like rom-coms, I guess, but we don't really, like, the epic love story. There aren't a lot of people making that kind of film with this kind of budget and with this kind of intent. So I think that's really what for Warren Beatty. And I was thinking about it when you were saying it. Yeah, some of the battle scenes, like when they're taking when the Russian Revolution's happening, there are some of them that are a little bit lackluster. And I wonder if he is making that choice to shoot it more like the way Woody Allen would shoot it than the way David Lean would shoot it. But then there are also these massive epic shots. So I feel like that, there's both. But I think I've probably said it enough, but with Warren Beatty, always keep your eye on the romance. It is front and center. And I think it's why his films aren't didactic, why political films don't feel like he's there to make a political point. His political point is love and revolution are just wrapped up together,
You would have had a real hard time getting 18-year-old me to go to a movie theater saying, "Hey, it's a great romance." Nope.
Well, and
that wasn't my genre when I was 18.
But I think that is the strength of Warren Beatty as a filmmaker, is that he can put that in the movie and he can have a great movie with that in it. And I think Andras, you touched on it, and I think it kind of bears repeating. They're not doing things like this anymore. Like a epic love story is like, nobody's going to throw $32 million behind a movie like that right now.
Funny, we're talking about George Miller. They tried to do it just recently, that Idris Elba.
3,000 Years of Longing. 3,000
Years of Longing is an attempt at an epic romance, but it doesn't have the politics. So it's more like a sci-fi romance.
Right.
Fantasy romance.
I'm really interested in this and your take on that, because all the films, I mean, it used to be sort of a joke about Hollywood, is like, well, they had to throw in a romance, to fill out the demographic, right? Like even when didn't seem like, the soldiers are marching through Bataan, and there happens to be an army nurse, and there's a romance or something like that. Because even, believe it or not, Hollywood worried about demographics 100 years ago isn't only today that they look at that. But is it possible to make a film that has a credible romance? I think that's a very difficult. I mean, I think it's so much easier to pull off space battles and D-Day landings than it is to pull off a romance that isn't cringeworthy or that you believe in or that like attracts you. I mean, the small movies, we were just watching, my wife and I, some French movies that, I mean, they're small. They're just like, two people in love in Paris. Okay, it's a romance movie, and somehow having Paris in the background helps, right? Instead of Omaha, but beach. but can somebody pull off an epic romance? I mean, does anybody make romances? Yeah, now, I mean, I'm just saying, Warren, so David Lean died and took the secret of the epic. Did Warren Beatty take the secret of the romance with him? I mean, he's still around, but I mean, just is nobody investing? I mean, there's love stories. I mean, okay, Max and Furiosa, wink at each other or something like that. But I mean, is that a romance?
No, in Mad Max, what's funny in Furiosa, they have a little bit of a romance, and it actually feels kind of like a welcome addition. But I mean, having just rewatched Fury Road, there's more of a there's no romance between the two of them, which is what makes that movie kind of so great, is that it doesn't feel like it is hamstrung by
professional respect. That's right. What they show each other. It doesn't have to devolve into romance. Yeah.
I didn't really love these films, but I think people would say that the Before and After Sunrise, the Richard Linklater films with Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, I think people would consider those to be, I wouldn't say epic. Yeah, no, that wouldn't be an epic romance.
Can you insert a romance? Like, I mean, Dune. Yeah, Dune had people who liked each other, but like, you can't tell me that like there was this incredible romance in Dune 1 and Dune 2 or Star Wars. I mean, I certainly growing up, I saw Star Wars, 9 times in 12 days. When it came out.
Again, we had lived a very similar life, sir.
Yeah. And Princess Leia and Luke, that was my young definition of like a romance, right? Like, okay.
And then you swing across the thing. It's like
that was a romance where they hug each other and like lift music playing. That was not me. But can you insert an actual romance into these movies successfully? Or Warren Beatty had the formula and nobody else did?
Jackie Brown, I think, works as an epic romance in the sense that the romance is deeply embedded in the story. It doesn't feel shoehorned in. It doesn't overwhelm the story. And the story is not about a romance. The story is about a crime and all that other stuff. I think to me, that's what it is that when the romance, again, like Bonnie and Clyde, it begins, they meet each other, there's this hotness, and then then it's not about, do we get to be together? It's not a soap opera. It's not a Douglas.
Genre subverting. He says, I'm not a lover. It's an anti-romance.
Yeah.
Right? In Bonnie and Clyde. I mean, that's why he flipped the genre of the lovers on the lam, right? Mm-hmm. Which was done a billion times before that, has been done a billion times since then. And again, this is why Warren Beatty deserves more attention, because he was somebody who was able to subvert a whole series of genres and successfully, or at least his attempts were wonderful attempts and deserve praise. And I think today's Hollywood, I guess, the negative part I find about most films made those is they're not even trying to do something interesting or new. They're just throwing money at the screen and hoping somebody's going to like it. But I think having a romance that doesn't stop the film and you go like, okay, all right, just get through the, I love you, kiss. Okay, now the film can start again. That's very hard. I think that's almost impossible, but really good films are able to do it.
Yeah. Could we talk a little bit about the Jack Nicholson scenes in this movie? Because to me, that's on this whole other level. Like the things, what's happening there, acting wise, filmmaking wise. To me, the film it transcends. It goes to this other place. I'm curious how those scenes landed for the two of you.
I think it's funny. You said it transcends. It kind of almost feels like it's in another movie. Like Jack Nicholson comes in from another movie that in your own mind is going on subsequent to this. Like Jack Nicholson fucks off, gets into whatever he's up to as Eugene O'Neill, and then saunters back in as, I mean, he's playing Eugene O'Neill, but like it does just kind of feel like Jack Nicholson just being Jack of a certain time in a certain place. He's really great in the movie. I will say, if it hadn't been Warren Beatty in the movie, Jack Nicholson in the movie would have literally just been taking the piss out of everything else because he is so good. And not that he stands out, because again, Gene Hackman's in this movie, Edward Herrmann's in this movie, Emmett Walsh is in this movie. There's a ton of people, great character actors, great actors in general in this movie, but there's a version of this movie without Warren Beatty where Jack Nicholson just torpedoes the movie by his presence alone because he's so good. I'm not saying everybody else isn't, but everybody else has to be as good as Jack Nicholson. Otherwise, Jack Nicholson just walks away with your movie about John Reed and makes it a Eugene O'Neill movie with John Reed and Louise Bryant just kind of hanging out in his movie.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Chris. I felt that Jack Nicholson did a fantastic job and should have not been in the movie. Going back to the idea of what to me, an epic has continuity. It flows without it ever having a jarring stop where you say, oh yeah, that's that, or that's that. And I feel like a lot of actors, if they're not the star, there's no question Jack Nicholson has been good as not being the star. But here, especially historical is so tough to do with known actors, right? Because it's so difficult first of all, I think it's very hard for actors to play, period. Have you done The Last Duel yet, Chris?
I have watched it. I mean, that talk about it's hard to do, period. And, jeez Louise.
God bless everybody involved in that movie, but like, oh my God, I didn't believe for one minute that anybody except the wardrobe master was in the Middle Ages. I mean, just like everyone was in Southern California wandering around. And I did feel that Jack Nicholson came in, just did this amazing performance, but it stopped me even in 1981 because he was well known even then.
Yeah. I think it's, you have to see, remember the first person we meet in the movie is Louise Bryant.
Right.
I think Nicholson's there for her. Obviously, he's there for her. He's not there for, like, his relationship with John Reed is not isn't that much.
Right.
He kind of thinks he's a shallow shit, and for her, those scenes are amazing. I've already said my piece. I think it's fantastic. And there is a story for people who want to lean into the myth of Warren Beatty's vanity, which I have a whole, I feel like everyone who makes movies is everyone in movies who stars in the movies that they direct has some vanity, and at the same time, you can't be a good director who does that if you are led by your vanity. But there is some story that there's some scene that Nicholson was so good in that they didn't include it, or he cut it in a way that undercut the Nicholson stuff just because of the fear that that Nicholson was just going to walk away with the film. So it's not just a concern. I don't know if that's an apocryphal story, but it is something that's been repeated many times in Warren Beatty lore around this film. So I think, that's definitely
Well, they've cut Jack Nicholson out of every Steven Seagal film he was in. I think that was, Seagal's choice as an auteur, to remove, because it would overwhelm his acting.
Yes.
Well, and I think to your point, Andres, about, these kinds of stories existing and someone like Jack Nicholson being in this movie, I think, and also to your point, Dr. Perlmutter, like it's hard to play, period. And it's hard to have anybody. I mean, you see it all the time with these movies like The Butler, where you have like 5 different actors cast as presidents. That's just John Cusack doing I think he played, I don't even remember who the hell he played in that movie, but like it's just like, oh, that's just X doing Y. And while Eugene O'Neill may not be the most publicly well-known persona and doesn't have all of his known tics and isms kind of narrated down to people, because I mean there are people right now mentioned, like, again, like doing impersonations is a parlor trick essentially for what actors are really doing in terms of playing real people. And you have actors going as far as a Natalie Portman doing a Jackie Onassis Kennedy and nailing it completely in terms of the accent and all that. But then you have people doing something else where it's less of a impersonation or an imitation, but more of an evocation. They're evoking a character, but they're not necessarily doing the accent, doing all of the isms that everybody expects. And again, not knowing enough about Eugene O'Neill as a person, you could just convince me, yeah, this is the way he's like, or you could say to me, he was nothing like this, and it's just Jack Nicholson doing the Jack Nicholson thing. Either way, the movie doesn't suffer, but I do think you run the risk, and the Warren Beatty story, kind of true or not, you run the risk of being upstaged in your own movie. And on top of everything else, like you mentioned, Andras, how many movies directed by the actor in the movie actually turn out to be good as this movie is?
I don't know. Orson Welles did okay. Woody
Right.
Allen's good.
But they're, I mean, again, they are, you know, outliers of themselves, right? Like, you know, not every, I mean, look, there are
Charlie
plenty.
Chaplin.
Right. Okay. I mean, again, like,
I guess the point I'm trying to make is the best directors are the ones. Albert Brooks, the best to me. That's why he's one of my favorites, because I feel like it's easy to be the genius when you're just behind the screen, behind the scenes, taking credit for everything. To be a total filmmaker is to also be able to be on the screen.
right.
Chaplin, Wells, Brooks, Allen, Beatty. You know, I guess I'm just thinking of the guys, but. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm a Greta Gerwig fan yet. She hasn't made enough films, but she's an actress she's an actress filmmaker. Hasn't done the two together yet. I don't know if she will.
Elizabeth Banks is technically a director filmmaker as well.
Yes, absolutely. But yeah, no, just going back to and he doesn't play the leads in his movies. So
No, he does not. And he can't do an Australian accent either. That's for sure. For Django Unchained, which again, is that an epic? I don't know. Like, I think what's interesting is so much of the conversation this evening has been about filmmaking and what it means to do a certain kind of film as a certain kind of filmmaker. And I think for me, ultimately, the most impressive thing, you kind of already alluded to it, Andras, and we've talked about it a lot. Warren Beatty made an epic film, and it works, and it subverts the expectations of what epics are. All of those things are impressive, but it's impressive because at the end of the day, it's Warren Beatty doing it. And I'm not saying his visibility is what makes it important, but again, because he is such a good actor and he is so well known for everything else, to be able to be well known for your ability to direct and subvert expectations as a director and co-screenwriter, like that puts you in a class far removed from a lot of other filmmakers. And I'm not saying that in a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying, like, you've elevated yourself into a position that, like you said, Dr. Perlmutter, should be talked about more. Warren Beatty should be talked about more as a filmmaker. I was joking before we turned the recorder on, like, how many people my age know Warren Beatty for anything other than his epic flub at the Oscars? And like, again, not his fault by any stretch of the imagination, but most people my age have got to know him from that. And I don't know what else. Looking at his movies, I'm not sure what movies would move the needle for someone my age. And that's unfair and unfortunate, because this movie, and I'm assuming the things that y'all have mentioned, are worth checking out now and always have been, because his ability to elevate things beyond it being just a epic is his success as a filmmaker and a screenwriter and a director. And a producer. I mean, again, like, Jesus, like that one of those is enough, man. Like, you don't have to do all four, but okay. Like, I mean, again, Andras, you've been in the film industry, you know, like one of those things is hard. 2, 3, 4, all of them.
Well, but I think in a lot of ways, I think you were going back to with the comparison to Tom Cruise. I think the comparison is correct in that I don't want to say Warren Beatty is the first movie star to really make himself the producer and filmmaker, because Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas had their bite at that apple, and certainly other major stars had their own production companies. Humphrey Bogart was in that space, but it really wasn't until Warren Beatty that you found a movie star who so fully took the reins as a filmmaker. Since then, it's become very common that, when you see a movie that Brad Pitt's starring in, he's a producer on it. Tom Cruise, and some of them more hands-on than others. Clearly, Tom Cruise, the whole Mission Impossible franchise, he's approaching that the way that Warren Beatty approaches filmmaking, in that he's the star, it's built around him, he hires Brian De Palma, the auteur director is working for the auteur movie star. And that works when you have a star who is that good at what they do, and that willing to share credit, but not willing to relinquish any control. And if they're good and they're smart, then you end up with something like the Mission Impossible franchise, which is a pretty exciting movie star, like move for an old man movie star to be doing, like in the third half of the third part of his career.
Right.
Well, Chris knows that Tom Cruise and I began our career together because I was an extra on Taps.
Oh, really?
On film, you can see me confront Tom Cruise. I think he was deeply affected by that in the rest of his career. I certainly was. In mine, yeah, you can see me as one of the town punks picking on Tom Cruise and the military cadets in the film Taps, which was filmed. I think I went and saw Reds right after Tom Cruise and I had our 2 seconds of screen time. So I think that's a great way to wrap this up. Tom Cruise was affected by Reds and now is the filmmaker he is today because of this movie.
And, that led to the classic line from Timothy Hutton about, that Tom Cruise character, I forget to get his name. He may be a madman, but you get into a battle, he's the guy you want. It's because he took you down.
He's our madman, as they would say.
This baby's fucking beautiful.
Andras, and then Dr. Perlmutter, final thoughts on Reds.
Final thoughts, you should see it. I think I've said it over and over again, but I think that Warren Beatty is one of the great American filmmakers, should be considered in any top 10 list. Whether or not he's actually on that list, he should be always in the conversation. And the sort of the magic trick of being able to make a film like this the year after Ronald Reagan was elected is indicative of his unique powers as a filmmaker.
What about you, Dr. Perlmutter?
I think that I agree with everything that Andras said and you said, Chris. This is an important movie. People should watch it. I don't agree. My 18-year-old me or my older me don't agree with some of the decisions made in the movie, but I think that's the point, is that when you watch a movie, you should be learning and asking questions about why a decision was made, why this is there, what works maybe for some audiences and doesn't work for others. It goes back to this idea of, I think what he was trying to do in the movie was talk about something that had been reduced to almost comic book stereotype of communism and anti-communism, and say there are layers and there's complexity and there's nuance and subtlety, which as an educator, I always say, those are good things. And so they're good things in movies. And so any movie that attempts that, even if it doesn't succeed in everything, which of course very few things in life succeed in every aspect, the aspiration to have depth and complexity is something every filmmaker should aspire to now and then. So good. Everybody should, after seeing this podcast, go see Reds.
I agree. I think that, again, the topical nature of the discussion being had in the movie, I think that, ultimately you both have alluded to the idea of Warren Beatty not getting enough kind of modern credit as a filmmaker is a shame. And I mean, that includes me. I haven't seen enough of his works myself, so I can understand why other people have gotten there. But again, also the discussion needs to change. It has to change at the discussion level to get other people interested, because so many listicles and other things parrot the same 10 goddamn filmmakers, and it's neither good nor bad. I mean, people have their opinions, they're allowed to have them, but I think Warren Beatty's name, just based on the strength of this film alone, needs to get mentioned. I mean, I know it shows up in the AFI list for epics. This was voted 8th, I think, out of, all of the epics out there, which I mean is a feat in and of itself. But yeah, this is a movie definitely in our day and age of all kinds of things being marginalized, events that happened just recently as a couple years ago, or as, over 100 years ago with the October and February revolutions. I think it's important to watch films being made by filmmakers who want to engage with you intellectually as a film watcher, which doesn't happen enough now. So on that note, we'll take a break, play some ads, and play a preview for the next Culture Cast.
Hi, I'm Susan.
And I'm Sharon. And we're the hosts of 80s TV Ladies.
Check us out wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
And please like and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at 80s TV Ladies.
You can find interviews and exclusive behind-the-scenes content on all of your favorite 80s TV ladies.
80s TV Ladies is the place to go. Please join us.
Hi, this is HP from Noise Junkies.
And this is Father Malone from Dark Destinations.
Please join us as we examine one of the greatest sitcoms in television history, Taxi, on Night Mr. Walters, a Taxi podcast.
Good night, Mr. Walters.
Good evening, and welcome to Night Gallery.
Thank you, Rod. And I want to welcome everyone to Midnight Viewing, where once a month we talk all about your follow-up to The Twilight Zone, Rod Serling's Night Gallery.
They say it's Rod Serling's Night Gallery, and it isn't really Rod Serling's Night Gallery, it's somebody else's.
Oh, we know. We talk about it a lot. Your curators at Midnight Viewing are the Projection Booth's Mike White.
What can happen to human beings when trust is wiped out by suspicion?
And CultureCast's Chris Stashew.
Small boy encased in a crystal ball.
And I'm Father Malone.
The kind of thing that usually infests nightmares.
Join us monthly at Midnight Viewing, the Night Gallery podcast at weirdingwaymedia.com.
Doesn't remotely belong to me. I have no proprietary interest in that at all.
A great flood is coming. The storm cannot be stopped, but it can be survived.
Rolling Stone raves, look out for Noah.
You stand alone and defy me, I'm not alone.
It's epic, powerful, daring, a triumph. The first must-see blockbuster of the year.
That's the end of everything.
Beginning of everything.
Noah, rated PG-13, in theaters and IMAX Friday.
So right on the next Culture Cast, we will be talking about Noah, the Darren Aronofsky film, a epic in its own right. I've never seen it, but I know that it is an epic, and it is about Noah and his art. I will be joined by Father Malone and the Projection Booth's Mike White. So until then, Dr. Perlmutter, where can people find you and the things that you work on?
Nowhere. I'm not on anything.
Wow, lucky you. Jeez.
You.
What's that like? Andras, what about yourself?
Well, I'm everywhere. No, my website is called Previously Yours. androsjones.com. You can also find it's androsjones.com will get you there. My podcast, The World is Wrong, there are links to there, but we have a website called The World is Wrong podcast.com. The World is Wrong, just so you know, is an extremely positive podcast where we celebrate films and film artists the world is wrong about. So things that have a bad reputation that we feel like is unjustly unearned. And my record, Recognize, De-Escalate, and Decode, is on all the streaming services, and you can find information about that at my website, previouslyyours.com. And thanks again for having me for this. This has been a great conversation. I needed this.
No, I'm glad. I'm glad you both. I'm assuming, Dr. Perlmutter, you would be saying the same. I'm glad you both enjoyed it. There's so much going on with the movie that I didn't think we would be at a loss for things to talk about, but the conversation went in some interesting directions. If you want to hear more interesting conversations, head on over to weirdingwaymedia.com, where you can find this show, so many other shows, including Father Malone's show, Dark Destinations, and Midnight Viewing, and The Projection Booth, which is Mike White's movie podcast, which has been going on for 13 years now, which is a very long time to be doing something like this. So yeah, that's where you can find all of that, other than one thing, which can be found over at Patreon, which is patreon.com/culturecast. $10 or more, you get to hear Rankin' on Bond, which once a month, Mike White and I, along with Richard Haddam of Richard Haddam's Paranormal Bookshelf, sit down and talk about James Bond once a month. So if that's something you're into, check that out over there. Dr. Perlmutter and Andras, thank you so much both for joining me. Like you both already said, this has been great. I hope more people watch this movie based on this conversation, because it's definitely worth tracking down, and it can be found on all streaming platforms for a price, as they would say. No free for anybody out there. And as always, we'll catch you on the next episode.